Some modern scholars view the Gospel accounts as simply folklore, with little regard for accurate history. But the actual evidence shows that the period between the time Jesus walked the earth and the writing of the Gospels was bridged by continuous testimony of eyewitnesses who were sources of authoritative and authentic history. Sworn eyewitness testimonies from most of the New Testament writers indicate that they were intended to transmit accurate history rather than conjured up folk tales, as stated in John 19, Acts 2, 1 Corinthians 15, and 2 Peter 1. Luke 3:1 states, "Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea." John 21:24 states, "This is the disciple which testifieth of these things, and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true." Further testimonies are seen in Acts 2 and 26, 2 Corinthians 2, and 1 John 1. The evidence of the text would make these writers liars if they were just making up folk tales, but most of them were persecuted and martyrs make very poor liars. We also have testimony from the early church leaders, some of whom personally knew and were pupils of the original disciples. One of these is Papias, the bishop of Hierapolis, who wrote near the beginning of the 1st century, and so was in a much better position than modern scholars to know about how the Gospels were written. Papias was quoted by later writers such as Eusebius of Caesarea. His writings, entitled Exposition of the Logia of the Lord, remain extremely valuable because of their early date and the fact that he reports about an even earlier period when the Gospels were written. He names specific eyewitnesses that were transmitters and authoritative sources of oral tradition. Papias valued personal eyewitness testimony, and he likely knew some of the original disciples such as Philip and John. Like Papias, Luke in his prologue also valued eyewitness sources. In his Gospel, Luke gives many facts that demonstrate that he got his information from those who had first-hand on-the-scene knowledge. Josh McDowell lists evidences for Luke's accuracy compiled by Roman historian Colin Hemer, who mentions specialized details known only to a contemporary researcher like exact titles of officials, identification of army units, correlation of dates of known kings and governors, undecided coincidences between Acts and the Pauline epistles, and offhand geographical references. McDowell notes that many times historians thought Luke was in error on some points, only to be proved wrong by an archaeological discovery. For example, Luke spoke of Philippi as a part or a district of Macedonia, proved right by archaeological evidences that district was the exact meaning of the Greek word meris that Luke had used. Luke referred to Lysanias the Tetrarch of Abilene in his Gospel, proved right by an inscription found bearing the name of Lysanias the Tetrarch and dated between 14 and 29 AD, just at the right time period. Luke was also proved right about the census taken at the time of Christ by archaeological findings, that in fact these censuses were done regularly and that one was indeed taken at the time of Christ, and furthermore that Quirinius was governor a second time in 7 BC. Archaeologists also found evidence on a papyrus document showing that during the censuses, people were required to return to their own homes and countries. Luke referred to the Philippian officials as praetors, and archaeological finds showed that in fact praetors was the right title for the Roman magistrates of the colony. And Praetorium was the praetor's office in Roman military, where legal sentences were carried out. Jesus was condemned and Pilate agreed to his crucifixion at the Praetorium. In Acta Pilati, a letter written by Pilate to Tiberius, Pilate uses the term praetor to refer to his predecessor and successor. Historian Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, talks about Pilate being the prefect at the time of Jesus and his involvement in Jesus' trial. Luke used the title Politarchs for the Thessalonian officials, proved accurate by several inscriptions found that use the title Politarchs, and 5 of them refer to Thessalonica. There are many more examples of these findings where Luke was right and critics were wrong. We see why Luke is widely regarded as a historian among the ranks of Josephus, Herodotus, and others. Eyewitness testimony evidence is likewise found in John's Gospel, listed by Paul Barnett. John is often portrayed by critics as being very theological with little concern for accurate history. But this view is totally against both the internal evidence of the text and against archaeological discoveries. John mentions many historical details that would only be known by a personal witness living at the time and would probably be irrelevant to a later audience. He describes the pool of Bethesda as having 5 porticos. When the actual pool was unearthed, there were exactly 5 porticos. The pool of Siloam mentioned by John has also been discovered. He also describes Jacob's well with familiarity. This well also has been discovered and fits John's description and location. John includes a side reference in chapter 10 about the feast of the dedication in Jerusalem in winter. Jesus seeks shelter from the weather in a particular place, Solomon's porch, which is part of the temple of Herod. We can conclude that the author of this gospel had first-hand understanding of the climate of Judea and of the architecture of the temple in the period before 70 AD when it was destroyed. As eyewitness, John mentions about a dozen places not referred to in the other Gospels, including the Pool of Siloam and the Kidron Valley. Barnett also demonstrates that the historical references in the Gospel of John fit the context of the times and that the details of the lives of the various people he mentions suggest first-hand authentic history of the pre-70 AD period. Also, the internal evidence of the Gospel of Mark, believed to be the earliest Gospel, shows details indicating an eyewitness account. For example, in the account of the storm at sea in Mark 4, Mark gives details such as Jesus sleeping in the hinder part of the ship. According to several church leaders, including Papias, Mark's Gospel was written as the eyewitness memoirs of Peter. Another example is the account of the demon possessed man in Mark 5, mentioned matter of factly in passing by the writer as someone who was giving on the scene recollections word. There are many more examples of this kind of details in Mark's Gospel. History unanimously records Matthew's account as the first Gospel. We also have internal evidence of a very short line of transmission between the disciples and the time of writing of the Gospels and Paul's letters. Tradition was handed on to qualified persons who were either named as individuals or as a group, such as the 12. Besides Luke 1, more examples are seen such as in Acts 16, 1 Corinthians 11 and 15, Hebrews 2 and Jude 3. We can see that regardless of the dating of the Gospels and other writings of the New Testament, the chain of transmission was short and in the hands of reliable eyewitnesses. In conclusion, we see that the Bible clearly is a wealth of reliable source of eyewitness evidence in itself. For an excellent reference on this subject, see Richard Baucham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, a scholarly work of extensive evidence that the Gospels were eyewitness accounts, including the evidence of names that were popular in the first century, that are used in Gospel accounts and not in later times in many other lines of literary and historical evidence. Acts 2:32. This Jesus hath God raised up, whereof we are all witnesses. 2 Peter 1:16. For we have not followed cunningly devised fables, when we made known unto you the power and the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty.